Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're actually going to look at how I structure my projects in SwiftUI and UI kit, and also discuss my thought process when I actually come to architecture and application. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be using Xcode 13. So if you see why my Xcode looks a bit different to yours, that may be why. And what we're going to do is we're going to build an app that interacts with the AnimeChan API, as you can see on the screen here. What we're going to do is use the endpoint that allows us to get 10 random quotes from this API. So I'll leave a link to this API in the description box below. So let's get started. All right, cool. So we've got Xcode open here. And if yours looks a bit different to mine, that's because I'm using Xcode 13. I'm currently using the beta until the actual release candidate comes out. So the first thing that I usually start off with is the constants. So what is a constant? So constants folder holds any kind of properties that I know will not change. So in our case, the property that our constants gonna hold for us is our base URL for our API, because we know that the base URL is never gonna change. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new group and call this constants, and then put a new file in there called API constants. All right, cool. So I've got my file, and as you can see, I've got an enum declared as API constant, and I've also got a static constant inside of here called base URL, which is the base URL for our API. So if I just quickly go back to the AnimeChan, you'll see that when you want to interact with this API, this is the base URL here, and then the endpoint following that is the endpoint that you want to use. So why did I use an enum, and why did I not do something like this where I just use a struct and then just say constants and then static let base URL? So essentially both of these two, when you look at them, they are the same, but when you actually want to use them, it's actually different. So the reason why I don't use structs for stuff like this is because I don't want to give someone the capability to instantiate this constant object. So by using enums, you can't really create an instance of an enum. So what this allows me to do is create almost like a namespace for my properties that I just want to access. So that's the reason why I use enums. It's to prevent you from creating an instance of this enum type, and you can only access the base URL property. So that's the reason why I do that. So the next thing that I normally do after doing this is I then look at my features that I need to build and create something called feature folders. So before we actually dive into doing this in Xcode, what I want to do is just go through a graphic that I've created to just discuss and just show you what is the purpose of each feature folder. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see here on the screen, I've got three folders. I've got login, registration, and forgot password. So what is the purpose of these three folders? Well, like I said before, with feature folders, what I like to do personally is I like to isolate features into their own purpose. So what do I mean by this? So any files that are associated to the login feature of my app will only go inside of the login folder. And likewise, it will be the same with registration and forgot password. So what do I mean by these files? You're probably wondering. So this could include things such as a model, a view model, a service, or even a view. So anything that's specific to that feature should live in the feature folder. So what we're going to do now is actually start to build out one feature for our application, and then we'll see how we basically group all these things together, and then we can isolate them so they all are related to each other. Like I said before, we're going to start on our feature. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in here and call it feature. And because the feature that we're working on now is to get 10 random quotes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this folder quote. So now that we have our folder quotes, what I'm going to do is I like to start off personally with using my models. So I like to add in my models first, and then do my UI, and then handle my service. So we're going to actually handle the model first, which is essentially the response that we get back from the API that we'll be working with. So let's create a new group in here called model. And then inside of this group model, we're going to create our model, which in our case is going to be called quote. So the API endpoint that we're going to be using is going to get us 10 random quotes. But when you're working with models, you don't want them to be plural, you want them to be singular. So in our case, we're going to call this quote without the S. Let's look at what we've done here. So we've got our quote here, which is our representation of the response that we'll get back from the service. And like I said before, notice how it's singular and not plural. So you want your models to be singular. And also notice as well how I'm just using the default decodable class that comes with Swift for decoding objects from a service or JSON responses. And then finally, if you look at all our properties here, if you notice, they're actually all constants, like none of them are actually variables. So why have I done this? So when you're interacting with data from an API, you kind of don't want to expose a property so someone could possibly change it. So by marking this as a constant, it allows you to make sure that your data from the service is reflecting what you're receiving, because you don't want someone to be able to change one of these properties and there's a mismatch between the two. So by using a constant, you're ensuring that the data that you receive back from the service is always matching what's in your model. So after doing this, what I like to do then is I actually like to create a dummy version of my model that I get back from the service. So why do I normally do this? So I usually do this for either a unit testing, if I need to just unit test a class and have a static property where I can access dummy data. And also when I'm building out my views in SwiftUI, I can just quickly view what it looks like. So what we're going to do is create a preview of an array of quotes that we would receive from the API. Now I'm just going to copy and paste it from some notes that I have. So as you can see here, I've got my static constant called dummy data, and this essentially just allows us to preview an array of random quotes that we're just simulating. So after I've created my model, the next thing that I like to do is actually see what my dummy data would look like in the UI. So I like to build the UI first to just make sure that that looks okay. So the first thing we're going to do is build our screen. So in order to build our screen, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder called screen. And then within this folder called screen, we're going to call our screen the quote screen. Cool. All right. So notice how I've actually called this screen quotes screen. And the reason why I've called it that is because this screen is going to show a list of quotes. So that's why we called it quote screen. You might also be wondering, why did I not call this quotes view? And me personally, it's a bit of a change that I'm starting to make when I'm actually building my SwiftUI apps. Is that I'm calling my main screens, and what I do is I call my smaller components that you see on the screen views. So a screen holds a group of views. That's the way that I'm approaching it and tackling it. So what we're going to do now is actually use our model, our preview, so our dummy data inside of our quote screen. So I'm going to type out some UI and then we'll see how we actually use that in SwiftUI. So let's do that. So let's just break down what we've done here. So the first thing I want to discuss is how I'm using the new attributed string API that's only available in iOS 15 and upwards. So this project is only iOS 15 and above, and I'm just getting the title and the label that you can see here. So the title here is in bold and the label here is not in bold. So that's what I'm doing here. And I simply just have a list that I'm looping through with a for each. And uniquely using the anime name to identify each object and just display some text in a V stack and a H stack. So what I would normally do is I would do this where I have my dummy data and now I can visually see what my dummy data looks like, so I can fix any kind of UI issues up front now without having to write the code to interact with the API. So this is a quick way to make sure that the UI is looking all good. So I don't normally like to then keep this like this. So this is the time when I would start actually refactoring. So the first thing that I can realize here is I've got a lot of this code here with the V stack, where this could actually technically be moved into its own view because we don't need to add this in within our code screen specifically. We might want to use this code in a different screen possibly. So what I will do is I'll then extract this into its own view. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, all we need to do is in our quotes folder, just create a brand new folder again. I'm going to call this one views. So within this views folder, we're going to create a new SwiftUI file called quote view. So notice how this doesn't have an S on it and it's just quote view. And the reason being is because this view will display just one single quote. So this is singular, not plural. So what I will then do now is we're going to inject our model into this view. So let's create a constant to do this. And you may be wondering, why am I using a constant and not a variable? Well, essentially, the only purpose of this view is to represent the data that it receives. So this actually isn't going to change any of the data that it shows. It's just going to show the data from the service. And you'll see that we now have an error in our preview saying that we're actually missing an argument for item. So let's fix that. And what I normally do here is I use my dummy data to inject a item into here. So let's do that now. So what we're doing here is we're getting the first object in the array of dummy data and injecting that into the quote view. So what I need to do now is I need to copy the VStack. So all the stuff from here, just cut this, and then I'm going to paste that inside of the body here, like so. And then obviously, because we're using this make attributed string to style our text, I need to copy this as well. So I'm going to copy this as well. And I'm just going to paste that inside of this quote view also, like so. Okay, sweet. So then what I'll do is I'll resume and then preview this. And as you can see, we can now see what this looks like. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is actually use our quote view inside of our main screen. So what I'm going to do is go inside of our quote screen and use our quote view within our for each loop. So let's do that now. As you saw now, if you look at our screen, it actually looks a lot less bloated compared to before. So it actually only shows our quote view that we've extracted into its own view. So now if we want to use this quote view in another screen, we can easily do this by essentially just injecting a quote view object into this view. So now this screen's purpose is only to show a list of quote views. And within our quote view, we handle any kind of UI that should be presented on the screen. So the next thing we need to do is actually start to work with our API. So what we're going to do is work with our service and then our view model. So what is the purpose of this service? So the service is the file that interacts with the API. So its only purpose is to interact and make an API request. That is it. So the reason why I personally like to separate my code into services and view models is because let's say if I have two view models that need to interact with the same API, I can only need to have one service file. So I can inject that service file into multiple view models. So let's go into our quotes folder again. And inside of our quotes folder, we'll create a new group called service. And then we're going to create our new file and we're going to call it quotes service. So notice how I call this file quotes service because the whole purpose of this service class is to get a list of random quotes. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the new async await API to interact with this service. So if you're using Combine, I actually do have a video on Combine in terms of how to interact with an API. So you can go and check that out and then apply those concepts into this. But for this, we're going to use async await. So you will need Xcode 13 in order to do this. So what I like to do is I like to define my protocols for the implementation of my class. And you might be wondering, why do I, if you've watched my videos before, like why do I even bother doing this? Like, why don't I just write out the class in general with all its functions? Well, the reason being is because I don't do it in all my videos, but when it comes to stuff like unit testing, it makes things easier because we can then actually fake our service class or our ViewModel class. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create our protocol for our quote service, and then we're going to write out the class that implements this protocol so you can actually see this in action. So like I said before, I like to call my protocols the same name as the file. So this is the quote service. So this is the base implementation for this class that I'm about to write. And as you can see, I've got a function here called fetch, which is async and throws an error if something goes wrong, and it returns an array of quotes. So notice how I have a function called fetch. So fetch indicates that this will fetch the quotes from this service. And also as well, what we need to do now is actually use our class to implement this protocol. So like I said before, by implementing this protocol, if we want to have a fake version of this service, we can now easily do that because of the protocol implementation. So let's get. So notice how in my class I've marked it as final. And the reason why I've marked this class as final is because I don't want any other class to be able to subclass this quote service implementation. And if you notice, I've used a protocol here to essentially just implement our protocol. So we get the function fetch here. And if you look inside of our class here, you'll notice that I'm actually using this here saying impl. So what does this mean? So this is essentially just a shorthand for saying implementation. So this is our quote service implementation that we will be using. So what we need to do now is actually write out the code to get rid of this error. And I'm going to do some async await to interact with the actual API. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here about async await. And I actually do have a video on this where I go into more detail that you should probably check out. I'll leave it at the top here in the cards and in the description box below. So let me type this out and then we'll discuss it a bit more. So as you can see, I've got my URL session. I'm just creating a string. So the interesting bit is here. So remember at the start where we created our file for our API constants. So this is where we're now using our constants and we're actually appending the endpoint onto the end of our base URL. And then we're just using the async await API available in URL session to interact with the API. And then if it's successful, decode some data, and if it fails, it will actually throw an error. So that's what we're doing here. So now that I've actually got my service set up, and as you can see, the only thing this does is literally does interact with the service and decode the data if it's possible. The next thing we need to do is actually use our ViewModel, which actually does a bit more than just this. So let's create a brand new folder here, and we'll call it ViewModel. And inside of our ViewModel, we'll create a new file called quotes ViewModel. So with this quotes ViewModel, what is the purpose of this file? So what this file will do is this will actually interact with our service class that we created a second ago. But now what we can do in this class is if we want to do any additional business logic, we can actually handle it inside of here. What do I mean by any additional business logic? So let's say you get a API request that you call, and inside of this ViewModel, you want to cache the data from the service into a database. Well, this is where I personally would do it because the whole point of the service is to interact with the service. The ViewModel's purpose is to perform any additional business logic that you need to do with that data. So if you need to cache any data to the database, if you need to filter out any kind of results, or maybe you just need to actually just create a notification, anything to do that isn't related to interacting with the API should be handled inside of the ViewModel. So what we're going to do now is actually use our protocol to define the implementation for our ViewModel, and the same principle again, where the whole point of this is to help us if we need to do any unit testing with this class. So let's do that now. Let's break this down. So I've got my quotes ViewModel here, and as you can see, I've defined my implementation. But if you notice the name of the function, it's more specific than my service. So this function here says get random quotes. And the reason why I've said to get random quotes is because the whole purpose of this function is to return a list of random quotes from the service. So that's what the purpose of this is. And if you notice as well, you'll see here that I've actually marked my protocol as an observable object. So the reason why I do this personally is because I always forget to add this to my classes. So by me adding it to my protocol, whatever class uses or implements this protocol will automatically get that capability for using the observable object. Now, looking at this, you actually could argue that this function that we've named here, we actually could make our service a bit more, you know, descriptive rather than just fetch. So what we're actually going to do is go into our service, and rather than calling this fetch, I'm actually going to say this will fetch random quotes. So I'm hoping you're starting to notice what I'm doing here, where whenever I kind of do something, I always kind of like to look back and reevaluate the situation and question whether if what I've done previously makes sense to what I'm doing now. So in this case, because this service is going to interact with this API endpoint that gets 10 random quotes, it makes sense to be more descriptive to say this service function should fetch random quotes because that's what it's doing. And in our view model, this will actually get the random quotes as well. So what we need to do now is actually write our class that implements this view model and uses our service. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So let's just break this down. So as you can see, like I said similarly before, we've got our final class because we don't want someone to be able to subclass this view model implementation. We've marked it with impl for the implementation, and it's using the protocol that we defined above. So there's a few things here. So I've actually marked this class as a main actor. So why have I done this? So if you're working with Combine, you don't need to worry about this, but with Async Await, if you want to return a response that interacts with some UI, and in our case, that UI is going to be our list that shows our array of quotes. You need to mark your function or your class with the main actor property wrapper to signify that you want to perform these updates on the main thread, or else it won't happen on the main thread. So by me marking this class, I'm just saying that I want my updates to happen on the main thread. So if you also look inside of this class, this ViewModel, I've actually got an array here, which is a published private set property of our quotes. So let's break this down. So why is it published? So the reason why it's published is because I want to listen to the updates that I make to this variable and cause some sort of like redraw in SwiftUI. Why is it private set? So I only want you to be able to change this array within the scope of this class. You can access it from outside, but you can't change it from outside. And if you notice as well, within this class, that I just basically initialize it with an empty array. And the reason why that is because we've not actually got any dummy data that we want to present to the user. So we're just gonna have a empty array for now. So that's why we have it set up like this. And something else that's interesting is I have an initializer called service where I inject my quote service into this class. So if you notice, I'm not actually using the implementation, I'm actually using the protocol. So what I'm doing here, if you've not heard of this, is dependency injection. So I'm injecting my object into this class. So any class or struct, I could say, or any object, I should say, that actually is of type quote service, so that's using the quote service protocol, can be injected into the view model. So you may be wondering, why am I even doing this and why am I not just instantiating the service within this class? Well, two reasons. The first reason is that if I was to do that, now my service is tied to this class, so I can't actually unit test the view model independently if I wanted to. Also, as well, what about if I have another view model that needs to interact with the same service? So because I've used an initializer like this, I can just easily inject my services into my view models. And also as well, I can actually make my view models more testable because of this. So I've used a constant because I don't want someone to be able to change the value of this property. I just want them to just have a service and that is it. So that's why we do that. And then finally, within our get random quotes, I'm just using the async await API to try and await the random quotes that we'll fetch from the service, assign that to our array of quotes, and then print out any errors that we receive. So because we're updating, we're going to be using this quotes on our UI. And because we've marked this as main actor, like I said previously, we don't need to worry about this not updating on the UI main thread and causing a crash. So now what we need to do is actually use our view model within our screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our screen, so our quote screen, and then I'm going to create a StateObject instance of our view model and inject our service into this view model as well. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see, I'm using the StateObject property wrapper, and I've marked this as private var, and I just called this VM for ViewModel. So I normally just call it, if I only have one ViewModel, then I just call it VM just to keep it short. And as you can see here, within my quotes ViewModel implementation, I'm injecting my service that I defined before. Now my service is being injected into my ViewModel so it can interact with the API. So you may be wondering, why did I use state object and not use something like observed object? Well, I've actually done a video on this, so if you, again, as usual, I'll leave a link at the top and in the description box. But the reason why you want to use state object within your screens and not observed object is because state objects are basically kept alive during the lifetime of the entire view. So the problem with using an observed object is that if your view re-invalidates and gets redrawn, it's possible that you'll create a brand new instance of your view model. With state object, it maintains the same state in memory and prevents you from losing any data. So if you're working with a view model that you need to instantiate, 9 times out of 10, you'll want to use state object over observed object. And again, in the videos that I've linked at the top, I also go into more discussion in my SwiftUI data flow series, which you can check out on my channel. So now what we need to do is actually use our view model to actually call the service. And in order to do this, we're going to use the new task modifier that comes with SwiftUI 3.0. So let's do that now. So as you can see, I've used a task modifier to just basically say that we want to await and get the random quotes. So this will use our get random quotes. And if you actually look at our for each, so our list is actually still using our dummy data. So now that we've got our service set up, I'm actually going to replace this with the quotes array that we actually set up previously. So let's do that now. So let's delete this. And then we're just going to say vm.quotes. So now this will use the quotes array that we're defining from our API. So now if you actually look at our screen here, it's actually empty. And the reason why it's empty is because if you go back into our view model, we've actually initialized just an empty array of quotes. But if I go into my preview for this screen and I actually run it, you'll see that it's actually now interacting with that API that we specified, the anime chan API. I forgot what it was called for a second there. The anime chan API, and you can see now that we've actually got a list of random anime quotes. So you can see we've got OG Naruto there, we've got Gintama and Hayaku. So we've got some good anime in this list. But if I just stop it and I just run it again, you'll see there's a bit of a delay. So there's a bit of a delay in terms of how long it interacts with the API. So what we need to do now is we actually need to use a conditional to show a progress view whilst this is loading. So let's do that now. So before we run this in a preview, let's just break down what we've done. So what I've actually done is I've actually moved my list out and I've nested it inside of a group. So now I've got a group to hold my 2 possible views that could appear. And on my actual group itself, I'm using the task modifier to get the random quote. So this isn't on my list anymore. As you can see, it's now on my group. So within my group, we're saying that if the view model's quotes is empty, then we want to show a progress view which says fetching quotes, as you can see here. Or else, if it's not empty, then we'll show our list of quotes. So as you can see here. So now if we run this, you'll see that we get our spinner and then we get our list of quotes. So this now looks nicer. So I'll just run that again. You can see there. So we get some sort of like visual UI, that's something, is going on. But again, you know me, I like to look at where we could improve these things. So if you actually look at our code that we have now, we've actually got bit of a problem, I would say. So let's say if we had another screen that interacted with an API, we kind of don't want to have to be repeating this VStack every single time for a progress view with some loading. So what I like to do is I actually tend to like to move any kind of loading views into their own base view. So what we're going to do now is create a folder called base, and everything inside of base is going to be any kind of component or any sort of like code that we reuse in multiple places that isn't related specifically to one feature. So it's more just like a general place for any kind of like miscellaneous stuff. So what we're going to do is inside of our app, outside of feature, we're going to create a new group called base. And if you actually look at this, our constant folder, again, is something that's kind of miscellaneous. It's not really related to each individual feature. It's kind of used within all the features. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this constant into base. So now we have our base constants inside of here. And then inside of here, I'm going to create a new group called view, or views, I should say, because this will hold a group of different views. And with inside of this folder called views, I'm going to create a new group called loading. And then within inside of this group, we're going to create a new SwiftUI file called loading view. So we just look at our progress view and our UI here. If I just stop this from running, so we can just see what it looks like. So we have our string here saying fetching quotes, and we have our activity spinner here as well. So what we want to do is we want to copy this and paste it inside of here. So replace the text. Now, I want this loading view to be as generic as it could possibly be. So I don't want it to always say fetching quotes. I might want it to say fetching users or fetching, I don't know, favorite characters or whatever that may be. So in order to fix that, what we're going to do is create a new constant called text. So you can actually choose what text you want this loading view to display. So you're not directly tied to just fetching quotes. So now we'll use this text inside of our text here, like so. And now we should get an error inside of our preview saying that we're missing the parameter text, which is fine. And inside of here, I'm just going to say fetching quotes. So now if we preview this, you'll see that this looks like it should do. So now if we go back to our quotes is empty, we can actually delete this and replace it with our loading view like so. And I'm going to give it a text of fetching quotes. So now we have a reusable loading view within our base folder that allows us to create a view that displays any kind of text that we want. So now if we just run this, you can see it says fetching quotes, and it basically gets our quotes from here like so. It's also worth noting as well that if you're working with things like extensions, I would normally put them, in my opinion, I would normally put them inside of the base folder here as well. So anything that's kind of like generic or reused within multiple places will go inside of the base folder. All right, so that's everything from me in terms of this video. So I hope you saw my thought process and how I tackle projects when it comes to like SwiftUI and MVVM. And if you have any other discussions or anything you would do differently or anything that you found interesting, I'd be really interested in reading it in the comment section below. So please leave a comment below. Also as well, if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up as well. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, and also as well hit the notification bell to get updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.